Hey there everybody, I'm Joe the Disney Guy and welcome to another Disney Guy review. Today we'll be looking at the final movie of the Wartime Era, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. So after the successful release of Snow White, the search was constantly on for more stories to adapt into animated features. Of course, in some cases, Walt didn't have to search very far because people were also coming to him with ideas of stories to make into features. One of these instances was in 1938 when animators James Brodero and Campbell Grant came to Walt with Kenneth Grahame's 1908 book, The Wind in the Willows. Grant and Brodero felt that due to the book's anthropomorphic animal main characters, the only way that the story could be told in a movie was through animation. When presented with the idea, Walt was actually quite skeptical and didn't want to do it, feeling that the story would be too corny. 7 singing dwarves, a puppet who comes to life, a flying elephant, these are all fine and good, but a talking toad and a badger, the line must be drawn. But a few months later, Walt would eventually have a change of heart, and he acquired the rights to The Wind in the Willows with the intention of turning the story into a full-length animated feature. And by 1941, a script for The Wind in the Willows, as well as a song by Frank Churchill, We're Merrily on Our Way to Nowhere, was complete. Fast forward a few years to the mid-40s, and Walt was beginning to look at various elements of American folklore, including Pecos Bill and Johnny Appleseed, which were seen in Melody Time. I waited over a month for that DVD, so I'm going to find ways to include clips from it. In fact, there were various reports that Disney was planning on releasing an entire slate of American folklore-themed tales. One of those tales in particular was The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, and in December of 1946, an adaptation of the classic story entered production at the Disney Studios. Production on The Wind in the Willows, now being called The Magnificent Mr. Toad, moved fairly quickly. After only 6 months of production, 33 minutes of the film were already animated. Walt brought in many of the animators from the recently completed Bambi to work on the film, and The Magnificent Mr. Toad was intended to be similar to Dumbo, a movie that was simply made and cost-effective. Of course, then the US entered World War II, and production on almost all of Disney's projects, including The Magnificent Mr. Toad, were put on hold. Yeah, I've gone over why all these projects were halted a few times. You can just click the link if you want to know more. The Disney studio would finally revisit The Magnificent Mr. Toad in 1945, but upon looking at it again, they changed their mind a bit on the project. They felt that the animation was too cartoony and fell far short of the standards that they had set in previous features, and decided that The Magnificent Mr. Toad would be better served as a short in a package film rather than a standalone feature. In order to do this, however, several scenes needed to be cut to make the film shorter, basically streamlining much of the story. Some of these clips were Toad buying a bunch of cars and planning his escape from the bedroom, or Badger being in a sanatorium, so yeah, for the most part filler got cut out in favor of main plot points. The next important step was figuring out which other short or shorts to pair The Magnificent Mr. Toad with in a feature. Originally, the short was to be part of a film called Three Fabulous Characters, with the Gremlins, a short based on a book by Roald Dahl, and Mickey and the Beanstalk. After plans on making a short out of the Gremlins fell through, though, the feature was renamed to Two Fabulous Characters. Then, of course, Mickey and the Beanstalk was switched out to be paired with Bongo in Fun and Fancy Free, so the Brave Engineer and Pecos Bill took its place, renaming the feature All in Fun. But then Pecos Bill was moved into Melody Time, and the Brave Engineer was released on its own, leaving the Magnificent Mr. Toad alone again. You gotta feel bad for Mr. Toad. I mean, all of his partners keep on leaving him. What do they have, some sort of aversion to amphibians or something? It was around this time that Walt began to look at The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and realized that it wasn't going to be long enough to be a standalone feature either. And finally, in 1947, Disney paired The Wind in the Willows and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow together under the title The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. See, now is that so hard? All you needed was 2 misfit films that weren't long enough to be features. It's like they were made for each other. As was becoming standard for the time, Disney brought in some big-name stars to help give its movie mass audience appeal. Disney searched through famous English talent to find a narrator for The Wind in the Willows, including actress and singer Gracie Fields and actor Charlie Lawton, before finally casting famed English actor of the stage and screen, Basil Rathbone. But the star power for the film was actor and singer Bing Crosby, who narrated, voice acted, and sang in the Sleepy Hollow segment. For those of you who don't know, Bing Crosby was a huge deal in the 40s and 50s. He's the 3rd best-selling actor of all time, and he had 41 #1 hits as a singer. Originally, Disney even wanted Crosby's kids to be in the film, listening to their dad sing on the radio, but the idea was eventually dropped. Heck, one of the taglines for the movie was even "Hear Bing Sing," so yeah, Disney was kind of banking on Crosby's massive popularity. And on October 5th, 1949, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad debuted in theaters.
Still, for the most fabulous character of all, I would nominate a Toad. J. Thaddeus Toad, Esquire.
So The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad was the final chapter of the Wartime Era, but was it the best? Well, one thing is for sure, both stories told in this film are pretty entertaining. I actually found myself interested in both stories fairly equally, which has definitely been a rarity in this era, and it's also a comment on just how strong the stories are, as they're pretty different in style and tone. And going off of how different the stories are, I thought that the movie did a good job of still connecting the two stories. No, the in-between scenes weren't nearly as elaborate or intertwined as they were in Fun and Fancy Free, but they served their purpose just as well. The use of Rathbone and Crosby, who really are two very distinct sounding guys, to introduce and compare two very distinct characters in Mr. Toad and Ichabod Crane, I thought was well executed, and at least created some cohesion between two otherwise totally unrelated stories. I also thought it was interesting to see some Hanna-Barbera-esque slapstick in the Sleepy Hollow segment, as it's not really something I'm accustomed to seeing in a Disney feature, but I didn't mind it. And the music in the film is really good too. We're Merrily on Our Way to Nowhere is a fun little song, but I think the various songs in the Sleepy Hollow segment is where the movie really shines. The scene where Brom Bones sings the tale of the Headless Horseman is catchy, jazzy, and probably the coolest part of the film. And as we established earlier, Bing Crosby's just plain awesome, so anything he sings, I approve of. Really, my biggest problem with the film was that it wasn't longer. The film runs only 68 minutes, which I would be fine with if I didn't feel like maybe each short could have benefited from being 10 to 15 minutes longer. While yes, I agree that the animation in this film isn't quite up to par with the classic Disney features, and that both segments being shorts was what was best, there are times in both segments where it just feels like we rush into the conflict and the main plot points before really establishing the characters. In The Wind in the Willows, we know next to nothing about the supporting characters, and even Toad himself we only vaguely know, so when he gets wrongly accused of a crime, we're only so outraged because the attachment to the character isn't quite there. And in Sleepy Hollow, there's a short scene that sort of alludes to Ichabod maybe not having the most pure of intentions with his pursuit of Katrina, and it's kind of assumed that Katrina is only using Ichabod to make Brom jealous, but why isn't all this fleshed out more? Like I said, with even just 10 more minutes per segment, I think that the characters and even some of the plot points would have been better defined, and that would have benefited the movie as a whole. But at the end of the day, this is still an entertaining movie, and like I said before, both segments stand out pretty well on their own. It may have just missed being a home run in my mind, but it's still one of the best films of the wartime era. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad actually ended up being arguably Disney's most successful film of the era. Critics and audiences liked it, praising it for being both legitimately scary and still family-friendly, and it even won a Golden Globe in 1950 for Best Color Cinematography. And like the other wartime era films, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad never received a full re-release into theaters, but the individual shorts were repackaged in multiple ways. Both shorts were aired on television at different points in 1955 as part of the Disneyland Anthology series, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was re-released to theaters as a featurette in 1963, and The Wind in the Willows, renamed to The Madcap Adventures of Mr. Toad, was also re-released into theaters in 1978. But seriously, how many different names have they had for this segment now? I can barely keep track. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, in particular, continues to be popular, even to this day, because it was aired on television so frequently in the 1980s and 90s around Halloween. Unlike a lot of other wartime-era films, however, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad actually received multiple home video releases, again both as a whole movie and as individual shorts, with the most recent being a DVD in 2000. But for those of you who are curious to see the film, maybe you should wait a few months. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad is actually being released on Blu-ray on August 12th, and as a 2-movie pack with fellow wartime-era flick Fun and Fancy Free. Mr. Toad and Company have also made numerous cameos over various Disney media, with the most famous perhaps being in Mickey's Christmas Carol as various secondary characters. Both shorts have their fair presence in the Disney parks as well, with the Headless Horseman kicking off the Boo to You Halloween parade at Mickey's Not So Scary Halloween Party, and with Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, which has been in operation at Disneyland since 1955. Actually, there were reports in 2012 that Disney was working on turning Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, which admittedly has very little to do with the Wind in the Willow segment, into its own feature-length movie. But as of this recording, I haven't been able to find out if that idea is still active. So all in all, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad definitely ended the wartime era on a high note, giving us timeless characters and stories that are still celebrated by Disney to this day. Well guys, that about wraps it up for me this week. I hope you all enjoyed, and let me know what your thoughts on the movie is in the comment section below. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, check out last week's video, next week's video, and of course, the Disney Guy Review playlist. And I'll see you all next week.